This morning we are beginning a sermon series on the 5 stages of grief. You may be used to thinking about grief in connection with something like death. But the reality is that grief is a natural response to any loss. It's the emotional suffering that we feel when something or someone that we love has been taken away. The pain of loss, it can sometimes be surprising, or there's surprising emotions that come up when we lose something, and there's shock and there's anger that we experience, and sometimes we feel out of control. We're not even sure how to process it. Sometimes we end up angry at ourselves for even experiencing grief at the thing that we've lost, especially if it's not death, if it's something that maybe seems trivial or like it shouldn't be a big deal. We sometimes are surprised by the emotions that we experience. We have disbelief or guilt. We can experience profound sadness. Grief is an odd kind of emotional response. It can even impact our physical bodies as our brain is processing the emotions. It impacts how our body actually functions, and so it might disrupt our sleep or our eating patterns, or even impact our ability to focus or to process things that we normally wouldn't have any problem processing. And the thing to realize is that all of these things are a normal reaction to loss. It's something that we all go through and have gone through at times in our life. These are normal responses, but the greater our loss, the greater the thing is that we've lost, the greater our response of grief. Which is why we so often think about grief in connection with times that we have lost a loved one, where we have experienced death. But the thing that maybe most often catches us by surprise is that even positive changes can lead to loss. Even when we have a positive change, oftentimes just the change itself means that we've lost something that we had in the past that maybe was also good. When we moved last year, it's actually right around a year from when we moved from our house in Creektown Borough to Portser Road. And we knew that it was going to be difficult for the kids, and we prepared them and things like that. But one of our favorite things to do in town was just to take walks on the sidewalks, and we would walk to the park and watch the ducks in the river. And we had talked about with our property that we were getting at Portser Road that we have some space that we maybe could get ducks. But that first week that we lived here, we took our first walk. And the transition had gone really, really well for the kids. We were actually surprised how well they just adapted into the new setting. But doing that thing that reminded them of something we had done in the past, going for that walk, it was just like all of the emotion of that week just kind of bubbled up and burst out. And so we're headed on our way home, and Deacon and Eulalia both are just in tears, and they didn't even really have words to express what was going on. And finally we were getting close to our house. And we were just trying to understand, like, why are you guys crying so much? Like, this is a nice walk. Like, what's happening? And Eulalia said, we moved to the new house, and there were no ducks here, and there were no goats here, which is something else that we kind of had talked a little bit about the possibility, maybe long ways down the road. But it was in that moment recognizing that there was something that they had lost. They had lost the normalcy of going for evening walks, the normalcy of being able to go and watch ducks in the pond at the park or in the stream at the park. And so there was loss there, and that brought grief. It brought these surprising emotions that none of us really knew how to process. So even sometimes positive changes in our lives lead to loss, which leads to grief. Even small changes, things that maybe seem like they should be insignificant, can lead to loss. Things like moving to a new grade in school, or moving to a new school building in general. Things like moving away from home, or even just leaving home for camp for the summer, can lead, if we have camps for the summer, but it can lead to experiences of grief. We call it homesickness, right? It is when we've lost that sense of connection to home. Things like when your kids move out of your house and you become an empty nester. And just those experiences of grief is actually the word for what you experience. Things like graduating from college or retiring from a career, being fired from a job, or even being promoted at work are all changes that can in the moment seem just minor. Most of our life stays the same, but there's little things that are changing. But that change, even when it's positive, even when it's minor, can still lead to experiences of grief. whatever the cause of our grief, there are healthy ways for us to cope with that grief, to help us to ease the pain, to ease the sadness and come to terms with the loss and find new meaning so that we eventually can move forward with our life. In the face of loss, we have this natural desire to try to control things, to run back to what feels like normal, to run back to the thing that it is that we've lost. But the invitation God gives us in the process of grief is to let go of our control and allow ourselves to be changed through that process. Loss and grief are an invitation for growth and change. But this change requires us to be willing to slow down long enough to actually experience our emotions, to actually listen to ourselves. Loss is an opportunity, and grief, what we experience grief through our loss, is an opportunity to get to know ourselves better and to get to know God better. If we're willing to slow down long enough to listen, to actually experience our emotions and to invite God into our grief, lamenting with Him. We find this all through the Bible, but especially in the Psalms of lament, where the psalmist sits in their pain with God, inviting Him in and inviting God to change them through the process. The reason that we're doing this series is because of the shutdowns we all have experienced because of the coronavirus. And I know that the last 3 months have been very different for many of us. Some of you, your life has been completely turned upside down. You've been out of work. You've been unable to be in touch with family or friends. Some of you live alone. And this experience has been extremely lonely and distancing. And for others of you, it feels like almost nothing has changed. Some of you are still going to the same jobs you went to before. You didn't have family or friends that you really interacted with on a regular basis before. Or maybe you live with your family or your friends, and so you still have those connections. So we've all experienced the loss of the last 3 months differently, but the reality is that we all have lost something. Whether it's simply the normalcy of being able to leave your house and go to the store without thinking about putting a mask on or thinking about what the dynamics of that environment are going to be, or whether your loss was something much more severe like a job, or maybe even your health for some of you during this time. Whether it was a job or shopping patterns or the ability even for us to meet as a church is something that we all share in common, that we all have lost over the last couple of months. And so each week, for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at a different stage of grief. And you've probably heard of these stages of grief, of denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance. And there's a lot of misinformation or wrong ideas about the stages of grief. They actually were originally developed in the 1960s by a psychologist that worked with terminally ill patients, people that had been given a terminal diagnosis and were actually grieving their own life while they were still living it, people preparing for death. But after she took some of her experiences and turned it into this book, people realized that actually these stages of grief were helpful for also looking at what a family experiences after somebody has died. And then there was also thinking about how these also apply to just how all of us experience grief in the face of loss. But these aren't necessarily researched principles, and they actually aren't even used in clinical practice by psychologists or therapists. And they were never meant to be seen as stages that you progress through. And we can think about maybe what feels like a natural progression to them, but the reality is that grief isn't a progression. Grief isn't something that you get over. Grief is something that you live in for a period of time. And these are all the different places we find ourselves in as we wrestle with loss, as we experience loss and the emotions that come from that. Grief is not a linear process. It's not something that you fix or that you get over. But I think these stages are still helpful for us to think about, a way for us to think about the emotions we've experienced in light of the coronavirus and the shutdowns that have happened. And I hope that this is helpful for you just in general as you experience loss in your life moving forward, that these ideas and ways of thinking about grief and how we experience it are helpful for us as we live through times of loss and change in our lives. I think that these stages, they give us a helpful framework and maybe even helpful language to feel and express our grief and our emotions. Kubler-Ross, who actually came up with these stages of grief, she said herself this is not meant to be a rigid framework. And in her last book that she wrote in 2004, she said of the 5 stages of grief, they were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. And I hope that's not what I'm doing through this series. They are responses to the loss that many people have, but there is not a typical response to loss, as there is no typical loss. Our grieving is as individual as our lives. This all makes me think about the Israelites. As we think about the Israelites in Exodus 14. The Israelites in the beginning of Exodus, we see them in slavery in Egypt. They've lost their freedom. They've been put in bondage and are being used as forced labor. And then after 400 years of being in slavery, then they experience a generation of genocide as their male boys, or their male babies, their boys, are either killed in the process of delivery when the mothers are in labor, or after they've been born are thrown into the river to die. And again we see that they are crying out to God. They are crying for God to deliver them, to save them, to bring them out of Egypt. And then God answers them. He hears their cry. He prepares Moses over decades of his life to be the person to bring back and deliver God's people. And then it goes through these plagues of God working to deliver them all the way through 10 plagues. They finally have been delivered. And they're celebrating as they're leaving Egypt. But then they get to the Red Sea, and there they see behind them Pharaoh bearing down on their backs. And they cry out, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." The Israelites in this moment are not capable of looking at what they have gained. They are only capable of seeing what they have lost. In this moment of deliverance, the Israelites aren't capable of seeing what they have gained and what God has given them through this process. They are only capable of seeing what they have lost. And we see this repeated throughout the book of Exodus and Numbers. In Exodus 16:3, we see they say again, "If we had only died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt," they said, "There we sat by pots of meat and ate our fill of bread, but you have brought us into the desert to starve this whole assembly to death." Again in Exodus 17:3, the people were thirsty for water there and they grumbled against Moses. "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Again in Numbers 11:4-6, they said, "If we only had meat to eat, we remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, because they were slaves. Also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna." And again in Numbers 14:2, they said, "If we had only died in Egypt, or even in this wilderness, why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" The Israelites were not capable of looking at what they had gained. They were only able to see what they had lost. And so rather looking forward to the new normal of the promised land they were heading to, they were trying to run back to the old normal of Egypt. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And we can be hard on the Israelites and they're complaining. But isn't that how many of us respond when we have lost something? This is the stage of grief that we refer to as denial. Denial in the face of loss isn't denying that the events happened. It's recognizing that they happened. But it's the denial that life will go on. It's when somebody passes away defiantly saying, "I will never forget them. Not a single day will go by that I won't think about them." As if you can stay there in that moment where the person was still around you. Instead of saying, "I will always remember them." Saying, "I'm going to take this person with me into my life as my life goes on." the negative side of denial. And remember, these stages of grief aren't necessarily positive or negative. They're things that we pass through, and there's healthy ways to cope with each emotion and each stage, and there's unhealthy ways to cope. And so the negative side of denial is becoming stuck, or even losing touch with reality. It's refusing to touch a room of a deceased loved one for decades sometimes because you just can't even cope with the realization or the reality that that person is no longer there. It's refusing to fill out applications for a new job because you're refusing to acknowledge that the old job is no longer available. It's refusing to move on to the romance of a new relationship after a hard breakup because you find yourself denying that life can go on. And remember, each stage of grief, it's not inherently negative. There can be a positive side to denial as well. So what would be the positive side of denial? The positive side of denial is remembering and lamenting. It's telling stories and it's mourning. When we find ourselves wishing that things could go back to the way that they were, we must allow ourselves to remember things as they were, both the good and the bad. It's actually an important part of the grieving process when we've lost a loved one, is not just telling the good memories, but telling the bad memories as well. Honoring the story of who that person really was and how they impacted our life. Remembering the past well. There's these things called cognitive biases, which are ways that we think that aren't really true or aren't really based in reality, but we think them anyways, and there's a whole list of them. But one of the cognitive biases is called rosy retrospection. It's the tendency for us to view the past as disproportionately more positive than the present. With everything that's going on around us, especially in the last 2 weeks, I said to Dana the other day, just imagine someday we're going to be talking to our grandchildren about the good old days, and we're going to be talking about what we're going through right now. But the reality is, in another 40 or 50 years, when Dana and I are older, we probably will look back on the good old days and we'll remember the good things and forget the bad things. That's the cognitive bias known as rosy retrospection. My grandmother, Ada Rosenberger, was one who refused to take on that cognitive bias. I remember her saying on multiple occasions, she would say, I don't know why some people want to go back to the good old days. As far as I remember, they weren't really all that great. There's probably some truth to that. But that's exactly what the Israelites were struggling with here in Exodus. Before they can get to the good things of Canaan, before they can get to their land flowing with milk and honey, they needed to let go of the good old days of Egypt. In order to gain, they first needed to recognize, to lament and mourn and let go of the things they had lost. Remembering the past in order to honor it allows us to take the best of what it had to offer, the best of what the past was, but then confidently walk into the future, making it the best that it can be. Ultimately, at its best, the denial stage of grief is an attempt to honor life. To thank God for the things He's brought us through and for the people that He's helped us to become in the past and through our experiences. At its worst, the denial stage is anti-life. At its best, the denial stage is honoring life. At its worst, the denial stage is anti-life, even anti-Christ. In a sense, the denial stage of grief can be us making the thing that we lost an idol. Saying life can't exist without this thing is the basis of idolatry, whatever that thing happens to be that it was. If we say life cannot go on without, whether it's the normalcy of shopping without a mask on, whether it's a job, whether it's the security of leaving our home without fear of a virus that's out there in the air, whether it's a child that we've lost, whether it's a friendship that we've lost, whether it's being able to meet together as a church at our building, whether it's a spouse, when we say that life cannot go on without something that we have lost, we have made that thing an idol. Since all life comes from God, in turning to something else for our sense of life, we have become anti-Christ, anti-life. We, like the disciples after Jesus was taken from him, are so drawn to normalcy that we go back to fishing. Rather than envisioning the new future that might be dawning, we can't imagine life without that one thing that sustained us for so long. Rather than looking through the loss, through the death, through the disorientation in hope of resurrection, we instead reject Christ, leave him in the tomb, and go to our fishing boats, looking for life there instead. I doubt many of you in the last couple of weeks have been running to your fishing boats, although maybe some of you have been going fishing, which is totally fine. But I wonder, what is something in the last 3 months that you have found yourself saying, life cannot go on without fill in the blank. Life can't go on without whatever it is that you've lost. In that moment, that thing, you have identified it as an idol in your life. Where are you looking for life? What things are you looking to for life? And I don't want to minimize anyone's pain. I recognize I personally am speaking very much from a place of privilege in all this. I have not lost all that much. There are things that I have lost through this experience, but not compared to what some of you have. And I don't want to minimize your pain or your experience. There is pain and loss, and we must be willing to feel that and acknowledge that and recognize that. But we must not buy into the myth that life stops just because we've lost something, unless that thing is God himself. And so what do we do instead? When we're in this stage of denial where we can't imagine what's next. And that's okay. It's okay to be in that place where we can't imagine what's next. But instead of saying life can't possibly go on without that thing we've lost, instead we remember that thing or that person. We lament. We acknowledge our pain and the grief that we're experiencing. We tell the stories of what was and what we appreciated, the good and the bad of that. When we don't even have the strength yet to imagine what could potentially be, to plan, we don't have the strength yet to plan for what the new normal is. We thank God for the life he has given us now, for the breath in our lungs, for the people our past experiences have made us to be. We, like the women on Easter morning, go to the tomb to lament. We go to the place of loss. We acknowledge the loss. We go to mourn and to remember what was. And maybe there, as we sit with our pain and discomfort, not trying to return to our past, but honoring what was, we might just find resurrection. We might just find a new normal that is better than we ever could have imagined. We, like the author of Lamentations, remember and call to mind. Lamentations was written when the city of Jerusalem was under siege. It had been under siege for so long that all of their food was gone. Literally, it describes women eating their children in the streets just simply to survive. They were surrounded by chaos, mayhem, destruction, and death. But in the midst of describing this scene, right in the middle of the book of Lamentations, we find this. I remember my affliction, my loss, and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him offer his cheek to one who would strike him, and let him be filled with disgrace. For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone. When we have lost something, anything that is precious to us, it's easy for us to imagine that life couldn't possibly go on. It's easy for us to refuse to even consider what life could be without the thing that we've lost. But the invitation of Scripture, the invitation of the good news of Jesus, is for us to sit in our pain, sit in our loss, remembering what came before and waiting for our resurrection, waiting for God to show us the hope of our new normal that is coming. This is a quote from an author named Caitlin B. Curtis. She says, "No matter who we are or where we come from, we are people who journey. We long for community. We long for oneness with the sacred. We long to be seen and known and to see and know the world around us. Part of the human journey is knowing what it means to grieve, to celebrate, to get lost and be found again and again. If it weren't so, we wouldn't be human. And to be human is to know the journey of transformation, to know what it means to change and become and often step back into who we were before. In my life," and again this is still Caitlin speaking, "journeying has meant telling the truth, coming to terms with the trauma, the loss in my own story, and leaning into the trauma and pain of others with honest listening so that together we learn how to be people who walk alongside one another in order to heal." As you experience the loss of this pandemic, whatever that loss has looked like, I encourage you to not look back to Egypt, to not run to the normalcy of your fishing boats, to not get lost in the chaos and confusion of your city burning around you. Instead, I invite you to remember, to lament, to name your pain, and to trust that on the other side we will find resurrection, that in Christ life will go on.